We will start with our own Steve Knight. Steve, in case you didn't know, is the president of the Washington Art Deco Society and a member of the ICAD's board. And he's going to talk about rediscovering an Art Deco master, Edgard Sforzina.
So we, like most of you, we are an all-volunteer nonprofit organization, the Art Deco Society of Washington. We oftentimes just go by our initials, ADSW. So, and our mission is like many of your organizations. We are here to preserve, educate, and celebrate the many facets of Art Deco heritage, including architecture, design, fashion, entertainment, film, music, etc. So what's really special about what I'm going to talk to you is it was this unique project, a unique opportunity that just kind of fell into our lap. And it was a really great intersection of both preservation and education. And it's preservation in a very different aspect than we tend to think of it, because what we're really preserving are artifacts. This is kind of the order of how I'm going to talk about things this afternoon. I'll tell you a little bit about the person, this unique designer, Edgard Sforzina, a French-American designer who came to the States in the early 1920s. Really interesting story. I will next tell you a little bit about our connection with him, which again is a very unique and interesting story. And then I will go through what we have just sort of dubbed the project, which has five primary facets to it. Cataloging, archiving the collection, creating a unique traveling exhibit, and that's one of my goals today. Is we have this great exhibit and I want to find the next place to show it. So I'm hoping I'll find a willing volunteer before the conference is over. We then developed a book, a catalog, a 300-page catalog. That's my other mission, is to sell some books while I'm here to help fund the project. So my friend and colleague, Debbie Chalfie, she's just behind the wall, but we've got some copies if you'd like. Here we go. Thank you, Debbie. We do have copies available, so please feel free to partake. And then lastly, I'll get into a little more depth on Sforzina, his body of work, and kind of his professional career and chronology. So in that picture, Edgard Sforzina is pictured on the left. On the far right is Robert Heller, who was a business partner of Sforzina, and who then went on to become really a significant designer in his own right in the late 1930s after he and Sforzina parted ways. And then in the middle is a woman by the name of Blanche Blen. She was Sforzina's secretary. So he came to the States. It's unclear to some of us just what his command of English was. Some people have said he spoke little to no English, and others have said, well, he did speak it, he just didn't like speaking it. So it's very interesting that somebody was transferred over here professionally and then just really didn't fully sync, I think, with American culture and language. And it was probably one of those things that perhaps hamstrung his career a bit. There is what looks like a pretty detailed chronology that we've pieced together. Professionally, it really is a patchwork. He came over, he was born in the late 1800s, 1881, was trained in France, worked for a number of firms. He quickly gravitated towards interior design and what we would now call industrial or product design. He was an officer in World War I. That was obviously a major interruption to his career. He was married at the time, and his first wife and a number of members of his family were lost in the influenza epidemic that swept at the tail end of the war. So after a couple of more years of work, he then starts with a firm called Alavoine and Company, which had their headquarters in Paris and then a second branch in New York. And he was transferred to the New York branch in 1922. So he comes over, presumably finds a place to live and gets settled a little bit, and then he immediately goes back to France to pick up his second wife, Isabel, and their one-year-old daughter, Lucille, and they come back as a family to the States and settle in Mount Vernon, New York. He then is working for Ellevoin and Company. We don't quite know what the full nature of that work was. Was he here to represent the company? Did he have specific commissions? Or was he here, was he managing the New York branch? We just don't fully know. And that is you're going to hear me say we just don't know of several times. It's a bit frustrating, but I think that's part of what makes this so interesting, is this is very much, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, this isn't the end, it isn't the beginning, but it's perhaps the end of the beginning. In other words, there's a lot more detective work to do, and that is one of our goals with everything that we've done, is to publicize and communicate and educate in a way that will hopefully be captivating for others to pick up and continue the trail. This sort of checkered nature theme of his employment continues. He is associated with, for a number of years, with Fellheimer and Wagner, which is a noteworthy New York-based firm that did, in particular, the Buffalo train station, and most importantly, for us in particular, the Cincinnati Union Terminal, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So we were approached, I got a phone call. The society used to have a telephone. It was in my possession for about 8 years. I think over 8 years I probably got 3 useful phone calls. And one of them was a phone call from this woman who at the time was living in Northern Virginia. Her name is Denise Allen, and she's the granddaughter of Sforzina. She had settled with her family in Northern Virginia for a career and to raise a family, and she had in her possession this tremendous trove of drawings and photographs and professional correspondence. And she said, well, I've got some work for my grandfather. I think we've always thought it was interesting. You might think it's interesting. Would you be willing to take a look? So by chance, I was giving a program, a lecture on Art Deco, and I said, well, why don't you come to this talk and we can meet afterwards? So we meet afterwards, and she pulls out a shoebox with a few trace drawings and a letter and a photograph, and the work is of tremendously high quality. The design integrity is fantastic, and the draftsmanship and the delineation is just top-notch. So we knew this was something very special, so we agreed to meet at her home to see more of the collection. That's what you're seeing here. We met with her first time. She just had a bunch of things arrayed on the dining room table. In addition to drawings and photographs, there are a number of really fascinating prototype furniture pieces that Sforzina had designed and had commissioned. These likely sat in his showroom initially, and then when he had to close the business in the early 30s because of the Depression, everything that was in the showroom was dispersed and disposed of. He took a number of things home, and the bed became the bed for his daughter, Lucille, who was dubbed Lulu, and he actually had added in marquetry Lulu at the foot of the bed. It's kind of cool. Okay. But, and these are things, just like many of us, we live with our family photographs, bits of memorabilia. These were the things that Denise grew up with for many years at home. A bit about the people involved. Jim Linz, our former president, President Emeritus. Jim has a tremendous wealth of knowledge when it comes to product design, and he's written a couple of books himself, so he was really the champion of this and really did most of the heavy lifting. So Jim is pictured on the left. Second to left is Denise, and then our graphic designer, Jennifer Byrne, and then on the far right is Deborah Sorensen, who was a curator with the National Building Museum in Washington, which is a really great institution. They've had a really hard time building a robust and sustainable funding model, and the pandemic was particularly brutal on them. They had to, in early 2020, they let go of 2/3 of their staff, including all of their curatorial staff. And we already knew Deborah very well because she had done a number of exhibits of interest. And when we realized the significance of at least the breadth of the collection, I called Deborah and I said, would you be interested in working with this? And she said, well, yeah, I've got a bit of free time right now. So she single-handedly worked alongside Denise to catalog over 800 pieces and photograph a number of them. And then we since produced high-quality scans of all the drawings, letters, and photographs. And then also Kara Brown, who's here with us today, and our treasurer, Lou Sinkowitz, helped with editing of the catalog. So it really was, it's a team effort, and I think that's really important to point out, a true collaborative effort of several people working together. And I think the other thing to mention is how Art Deco at this point, it's 55 years old as sort of this scholarly body that everybody understands. And we think we know it all, but we don't. We continue to find new and interesting designers and artifacts. And they're worth talking about and exploring because it really helps to fill out the narrative and just adds so much more richness to it. So, back. So the exhibit, that was our next venture, was to develop a traveling exhibit. It's 16 of these vertically tracking banners. It's been shown in 3 venues so far, 2 in Washington, D.C., and then most recently in Cincinnati. And our goal here was to really, again, well, I guess I should say, Denise's goal, the granddaughter's goal, was to find a home for the collection, a museum or a university perhaps. And our fear was, if she was successful, that everything would just sort of go into a vault, into the archives, rarely if ever to be seen again, and they would hold control over it. So we were very interested in communicating, and that's where our education component of our mission comes into play. We really wanted to communicate and share this with lots of people, so that's where the exhibit comes into play. When we were putting that together, it was really hard to whittle down with hundreds of drawings and images. We had to whittle down very quickly to create an exhibit that would be very effective and communicate clearly. So therein we found another opportunity, which was, well, let's put together a catalog, because there we can truly show everything that we have access to, which was the next step. That's the cover of the book. Really interesting design for a desk, and this is very, you see a lot of this in his work. In particular, that's a built-in light fixture at the crown of the inside corner of the desk. We sort of previewed the book in Cincinnati, coinciding with their 20th century show in February. And one of the fun things was Denise's family treated it as, everybody came together. It was like a family reunion. So we all met at Union Terminal, had a great tour, and Sforzina is credited with interiors design here, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it was just neat seeing the family go around, taking pictures of them with different corners of the building. We got a really great, thorough tour. That's Denise at the head of the table with her sisters, and that's all of the blood relatives that came. Some came from far away as France and Germany to be there. So again, like I said, his career was a bit checkered in terms of who he worked for and when. So you see a number of examples of different versions of stationery. At one time, he dropped the S from the front of his name, presumably to make it easier to pronounce. We're not quite sure why, but then he quickly added the S back for whatever reason. As we started to do research for the book, we were finding more primary and secondary resources, in particular journal articles, magazine articles from the 1930s, Country Life magazine, The Upholsterer, a number of really, at the time, well-regarded journals, and he was quoted throughout, and his work was cited throughout, and he was cited as the author of that work. At one time, he exhibited, a couple of times he exhibited really noteworthy post-1925 exhibits that held primarily in New York. And he was in the company of Donald Desky and Joseph Urban, and you could think of a great designer from that era. He was in that company. So it's clear he was very well regarded at the time in the late 20s and early 30s, but then he sort of quickly falls off the map. He's still doing things, but he's just not doing it with his own, credited to himself. That's a really interesting image on the left. It's a brochure for a home correspondence interior design course put together by Paul Frankel. And Frankel chose to use the bedroom suite that Sforzina had designed for a client as a really good example of this is the kind of stuff you're going to learn if you take my course.
In 6 easy lessons.
In 6 easy lessons. He did a lot of really interesting things with lighting. He perfected techniques for indirect lighting, concealed lighting, like you see in the Lily Dash millinery showroom in the upper right. Union Terminal. So we were, of course, there in 2017 for a pre-conference, but at the time the building was closed for significant renovation and restoration. It had really fallen on hard times. We were just back a couple months ago for the book opening, and it's a real treat. If you've never been, you should really go. It looks beautiful. The city loves this building. They understand how special it is. And so the quick story here is that Fellheimer and Wagner was hired to design the station. They had perfected sort of the guts of modern rail travel terminals in terms of how trains come in, how passengers queue, how luggage is handled, and so forth. They had a really good schematic that they had perfected. Their design, however, was not particularly looked upon with much favor. It was a bit sort of dusty and too traditional for what the city wanted. So they quickly pivoted and hired Paul Cray to design the exterior. And where Sforzina comes in is on the interiors. That really was, I think that was his sweet spot of design. And at this time, in notes that we found that he's handwritten, he said, from 1930 to 1933, I spent nearly 3 years working on the biggest, most significant train station in the United States. And we've got a number of drawings that really prove that out. So there's the executive office suite, the secretary's room, the waiting room, the board room, the president's office. And those are his drawings, signed by Sforzina. His own handwritten notes, very specific specifications about woods and materials and fabrics, the marquetry on the walls and in the floors. So he really had very good technical depth of understanding of materials and how things go together. And then as you sort of work your way around the building or in other spaces, we find, and we can pair up, again, the drawings with other components in the building, we find that he was clearly at work here. And I think another thing, and this is a bit personal for me as a practicing architect, most firms, even today, it's always the person with the name on the letterhead that gets the sole credit. And we all know that any building requires hundreds of people to design. You need people who are good with aesthetics, people who are good business people, technicians, people who know how to put flashing around windows so that the water doesn't leak. And you need tons of people, and they never get cited. And this is probably an example of that. We don't know, again, fully what the working relationship was. Was he in the office of Fellheimer and Wagner for this period of time, or is he working more on a contract basis? Perhaps it's a little bit of both. There's the famous Rookwood Rookwood Tea Room that's credited to Rookwood Pottery, and Henschel is the ceramicist. But it's clear there had to have been a designer who figured all that out, and we think it was Sforzina. And the light fixtures in here are really incredible. And we found a sketch of that light fixture Sforzina had done, again, in his own hand for another project, and they're very similar. So we think his involvement, his influence on the building is much more extensive and clearly goes beyond just that suite of offices that I showed you. You know, probably one of the best examples, and this is kind of the sad thing of interior design, particularly in commercial venues. This stuff tends to get changed out every 10 years because owners want to refresh and keep things current and up to date and trendy. And this was the Milgram's department store, a really high-end shop in New York that survived only until the 1950s or 60s. But it was probably one of the best examples of French-inspired high Art Deco at the time in the States. He was credited with designing the Riverside Drive apartment for George Gershwin. This really incredible daybed with a kind of stepped skyscraper bookcase in the corner is really neat. It again has an interior, or excuse me, a light fixture that's built in on that inside corner. Gershwin's bedroom, which is very similar to that prototype double bed that Sforzina had designed and he had in his own home, and that Denise had in her own home in turn for a number of years. I'm just do a quick breeze through the collection. This is the second part of the catalog, so this is where we didn't have to make any hard choices, and in 300 pages we can show you nearly 800 of his designs. But this is a really cool design for a pedestal bar. So the sides come down like a butterfly, and you have access to the barware and all of the liquor. And most of this body of work was produced in a very concentrated period, from about 1932 to 1937. We suspect that what this represents was a really, it's work that he was probably intending to incorporate into a portfolio that he could use to market himself. So it is a very compressed period of time, but the breadth of work is incredible. The quality of the designs, again, the quality of the delineation is just superb. Another fun aspect of the book, and I think this is fun because it sort of, it warms the book and it gives you connectivity to the person and the family. So that's a picture of Denise with her two sisters, and she wrote a number of sort of these passages, these anecdotal passages on what it was like to grow up. Because Sforzina died quite young. He died in 1941. Denise did not come along until the 1950s, and she always heard these wonderful stories about, you know, your grandfather was a very important man in his day, and he was very significant. And so to have access to that and to be able to share that in the book, and a number of the stories that were handed down to her, we thought was pretty nice. And in ways, while it probably, a lot of it requires substantiation, and we did have to rein Denise in a few times with sort of overstating things, I think it really helps sort of add warmth and color to the narrative. Again, just incredible variety of design as well. He functioned not only as an interior designer, but also as a product designer. These are some really top-notch examples for design of a clock and some cocktail shakers. Some furniture, a really great rendition of a kind of a streamlined baby grand piano, built-in bench. He loved sneaking built-in bars into nearly any piece of furniture he could think of. And then these are a bunch of designs for probably fabric or wall covering patterns. Just really, again, really beautifully done. Lamps. And then he also, there's a really interesting concentration of residential designs for very small modern houses of about 800 to 900 square feet. Very compact, very well thought out. And in addition to working out the plans and the elevations, he also developed interiors to go along with them. So that's kind of a corner fireplace with built-in settee on the left that corresponds to one of these house designs. Okay. A few more examples. He worked with Fellheimer and Wagner on a design for new CBS headquarters. It was not realized, but it's a really neat building. So that's about it. Thank you.
I'll take questions. Okay, does anyone have questions for Steve? If so, raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you, even if you're way in the back.
I don't have a question, but I just have a statement. The colors and drawings are much more vivid and gorgeous than they appear in these slides, since they're not turning the lights off.
Yeah.
So you definitely want to look at the book. His work is incredible. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was wondering, Steve says, this was first discovered in his checkered history. Does anybody, know whether he had such a checkered work history because he was, really hard to work with, or because he was very English, or, it seems like he was working then.
I mean, I have a few theories on his checkered history, the checkered employment history. I think at first he was a consummate artist. He really cared first and foremost about the work and was less interested in self-promotion and probably a number of things that that you need to do to really run a sound, consistent, and sustainable business. He's characterized as being very warm and charming, but also very serious. We do have evidence of one sort of professional breakdown, disagreement, if you will. For a few years, he was associated with the business partner, Sam Mandeville, and they did a number of retail interiors together, and they just had a big falling out, apparently. But that's the only one I'm aware of.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.